on the exciting and often sort of contentious subject of Mad Men, the Modern Family, examining the role of men in social development. So I wanted to sort of like say a bit of a preamble in light of the fundraiser. For those of you who were here, we had our pamphlets out and they said the title, Mad Men, Modern Family, etc. And a certain sort of discussion broke out about whether the sort of text and subtext of the conference was itself sort of subliminally a little offensive to men, that mad men, and the sort of insinuation that that's not really an insinuation, but it's overt. And so from that, I think as that sort of like train of thought has been sort of carrying us through the weekend, there's been some sort of conclusions and some clarity, I think, that's come out of a lot of like fog that I think permeates the cultural debate on gender. Or even if you, I don't know about your Facebook, but if I open my Facebook, it's sort of this inundation of certain ideologies, certain perspectives, and so sort of weighing those and trying to figure out what's affirming and what's just plain old rude and mean on any level in terms of whether you're talking directly to men or about women. There's certain sort of norms that are not upheld across the board. So in light of that, and in light of the conference that we've had today, discussions and different lectures, the perspectives and solutions put forward from each lecture have on the one hand been as diverse and subjective as I think personal experience is diverse and subjective. And so that said, I think what's really become clear is that the string connecting both the mission of WIA and to all of these ideas that we've been talking about this weekend is the very basic underlying need to affirm the value of all persons. And it seems so simple, and yet it's so hard. And what I mean by that is the very basic recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. I wish I could say that preamble was my own, but it's of course the preamble of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I won't read all 31 articles, but I think these sort of complicated questions, or the questions that perhaps we complicate regarding gender, equality, consent, marriage, family, are really quite simple if we just look at article number 1. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of, insert group of kinship here. It says brotherhood, but of course that's contentious. So anyway, there is still a debate at hand. But Dr. Nathanson and Dr. Young spoke today about the need for men to be able to make at least one contribution that is either distinct, necessary, or publicly valued.
Not or,
and, sorry. And I do agree with this, and I would propose, this doesn't get at all 3, but that as a starting point, recognizing that all women are distinct, and therefore, as their individual contributions in society necessarily reflect this. And that was confusing, but that is to say that as individuals are distinct, so are their contributions, regardless of male or female. And it's just like a family, in terms of tying in the theme of the family. That just as each member is distinct in our needs and our gifts, so are the expression of those needs and gifts. And so I want to be clear, as there was some debate in the last few hours after our last speaker, that WIA is not promoting marriage and family as an end in itself. And I think that's really important for us to think about and remember. It's neither a way to make more money and cash in on that fatherhood premium that Wilcox talked about, nor is it a surefire route to increasing one's happiness quotient. Marriage and family are good even when they are hard or challenging, because to quote the WIA Declaration on the family is a school of deeper humanity, within which each member learns best what it means to be a human person. There, each member of the human family, from conception and natural death, experiences the gift of unconditional, enduring love. And so, with that goodwill and spirit on our minds, I'd like to welcome you all here. I'm excited that you're here and joining us for this discussion, and I wanted to introduce our panelists and our moderator. So we have extensive biographies for Dr. Katherine Young and Dr. Nathanson, as well as Wayne Adams. So bear with me, as these are very important people you have before you, as well as our moderator, who I'll get to. Dr. Katherine Young is a professor emeritus in the Faculty of Religious Studies at McGill University. She published in 3 fields, Hinduism, ethics, and gender. Using her historical and comparative training, she provides backgrounds for some of the difficult problems of our time, including marriage, reproductive technologies, euthanasia, violence, and academic freedom. On the topic of gender, she has edited or contributed to 16 books on women, and with Dr. Paul Nathanson, she has co-authored 3 books on men focused on the problems of misandry. They are Spreading Misandry, Legalizing Misandry, and Sanctifying Misandry. A 4th, Replacing Misandry, is forthcoming this year, and a 5th, Transcending Misandry, is out next year. Dr. Paul Nathanson is a researcher at McGill University's Faculty of Religious Studies. He began his academic career by writing about the ambiguous relation between religion and secularity, especially on secular myths and secular parables. More recently, he and his colleague at McGill, Dr. Katherine Young, have written about secular religions, political ideologies on both the left and the right that function as fundamentalist religions. Dr. Nathanson has authored articles such as I Feel, Therefore I Am, The Princess of Passion and the Implicit Religion of Our Time, and several books on attitudes toward men in ideological feminism. So far, McGill Queen's University Press has published the first 3 volumes in a series of 5 on misandry. Sorry, to your point earlier. Spreading Misandry, the teaching of contempt for men in popular culture, legalizing misandry, from public shame to systemic discrimination against men, and sanctifying misandry, goddess ideology, and the fall of man. So you have just received an extensive Amazon list to pursue. Next we have Wayne Adams, who's a Brooklyn-based artist, and he received his BFA from Calvin College and his MFA from Washington University in St. Louis. Louis? I always think of maybe in St. Louis, and then I get it wrong. Adams has exhibited throughout the Midwest, New York, and Vienna, Austria. Recent shows include Wayne Adams is Speaking in Tongues, a show of objects and images organized by the Unrelenting Voice of Interpretation at the Barrington Center for the Arts in Wenham, Massachusetts. Also works off canvas at the Denny Gallery in New York, and Control Alt Delete at the HKJB in Brooklyn, New York. Adams Miracle, the Storefront Gallery in Brooklyn. And Wayne has written numerous articles for publications such as Scene, the Journal of Christians and the Visual Arts, Image, a Journal of the Arts and Religion, Site 95, and Comment Magazine. Adams is currently serving as the president of the Board of Christians in the Visual Arts. And last but not least, we have...
No, seriously, I'll explain something.
Okay, we have our panel moderator, Juliana Reno, and I will give my own intro, which I have not prepared, nor is it in the brochure. And that is that in thinking about the panel and how we wanted to shape it and who we wanted to be on it, First Things, as you may have seen, is a co-sponsor for this event. And so this is, our thinking along those lines was that we would have someone very important from First Things. And I don't know how to, my whole lead up to this was going to be a slightly misandric comment. But anyway, Juliana is the wife of Rescue Reno, the editor of this thing. So we thought that would be a nice twist to sort of throw in to the debate and this discussion. So.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me. We've got this great panel. So here's what I'm going to do. I've got a whole bunch of questions to get them going. So, and then you should, if you don't have any questions, and a couple of people have suggested that you might have one or two. If you don't have any, I've got plenty, but you should just jump in. So I don't need to ask my questions. I'm going to ask the first set to lead it off. So I'm going to give you your questions first, and then I'm going to tell them going up so that you have 30 seconds at least to think about them, okay? So the first, that's why I made her not introduce me. The first set of questions is about who is having the conversation about the role of men in family or society? Who's talking about it? Is it all women, or are there also men talking about it? Which men? So your question is going to be who's talking about it, and your question is going to be who's listening, right? And your question is going to be how are the visual arts contributing to that conversation? Okay, so while they're thinking their answers, which I know they could do without this part, but it's still can be played, right? So I'm going to tell you 30 seconds about me so that you know where my biases are, because I think that's probably a little important, right? So I'm Jewish, and I got married halfway through my senior year in college. I was a religion major. I married halfway through my senior year in college. Worked for 3 years to put my husband through finished graduate school, and then he worked and I went to law school. My daughter was 6 months old when I started law school, and my son was born halfway through law school, and I've been working as a lawyer for the last 20 years. So I work full time and always have, and I have two beautiful children who are now almost 25 and 23. And my husband works more than full-time and always has. He was a professor for many years, and now he's the editor of First Things, and he works way harder at that than he ever did at being a professor. So, okay, so now the question, which is, are men having this conversation? Obviously, some of them are. Or is it mostly women, and how does that all play out?
Well, I don't know the numbers, of course, but I mean, there are men who are talking about it, not necessarily productively, but they're talking about it. I would say, well, the men who call themselves and who are called by some people men's rights activists. Now, these are people who are, I think many of them are very angry because they have been encumbered in situations of not being able to see their children, or they have had a raw deal with divorce, and so their conversation is really heavily dosed with anger, and sometimes it comes off as ranting. They're not necessarily interested in the larger social and historical forces that have produced their problems. But some of them might have. There are other people who actually are thinking in I would say, a more constructive way, maybe because of the luxury of not having dissolving families around them. There probably are religious groups that are talking about it. But I'd say it's kind of unfocused at this point. There's a recognition that there are problems, but I'm not aware that there's anybody who's really focusing on fatherhood as part of a larger social and cultural matrix.
Culturally speaking, though, do you think it's, aside from the academic part, which I know is your specialty, but just sort of getting behind that to the roots of the research that you do, is it mostly women who are interested in this question, or are men actually interested in this question?
No, I think some men are. I don't have numbers.
No, I'm not.
There certainly are a lot of women who are concerned about their sons. I'll tell you.
Do you know each other?
I'll tell you who's not talking about it.
Okay.
And that is young men, students. They're either terrified of the topic, they have no idea about their own identity, they tend to be very passive, they probably don't talk about much for fear of antagonizing their girlfriends. They're a sort of in a twilight zone. I'm telling you this, I have extensive reports from a friend who teaches at Wagner College on Staten Island, and he tells me this over and over again about his male students. They're like zombies, he says. It's not that he's unsympathetic, it's not that he doesn't try to involve them in their classes, but they tend to be silent in class. They don't say anything. So he describes them as being people who are, or at least consider themselves defeated.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just that so when I got married, more personal history here. So my mother got married in about 1960, and I got married in about 1986. And she said to me, when I was we were doing the wedding, she said, well, when I got married, Juliana, the mother's role was completely clear, and now it's not, and I don't know what the heck to do. You know, so you gotta give me a little guidance here. So what I'm hearing from you is that there's not an obvious role, right? That if we had looked at male students, undergraduate students in the 60s, they would have not been in the same position. So now the role is not as clear, and their reaction is to either go away mentally or to feel defeated, and so that it's taken some grounding out from underneath them. Is that what you're getting at, I think?
Yes.
Okay. So when men do have a conversation, and moving on, when men do have a conversation about our roles, is anybody interested in listening to what men have to say, or is this just women want to talk to women about it?
I don't think too many people are listening to men yet. There's a few women who are writing books on the subject, and they appear on the same conference circuits. Someone like Christina Hoff Sommers, who, you know, wrote about boys.
What's her shtick?
Boys are boys, and let them
Okay.
be themselves and develop, and why think that they're terrible. But
beat up my daughter in the playground. No.
Well,
Not beat up.
they might, but, you know. Okay, so there's a few women around, but when we were doing our research, we kept saying to each other, can't we find some good feminists who are talking about these subjects? Because who wants to always quote all this negativity? It got depressing, frankly. And where's some hope, and where are some different voices? And we could not find many women through the 80s and the 90s, even into the last decade or so. There are more women's voices coming online, and as Paul just said, often it starts out with women who have sons, because they see the statistics on sons, on young boys, and they're appalled. And this is their son who is, you know, being given images of popular culture that they're a buffoon, they're inadequate, they're evil, it's a barrage. Once you get sensitive to this and you start to watch the TV serials and the films, and you say, this is my son, and these are the only images that are being given to this young boy who doesn't know anything about gender and the politics of gender and all of this, something is going really wrong. So those women, I think, who...
So moms.
Moms
of at least 10 years old kids.
Getting really sensitive. They're worried about high school dropout rates of boys. They're worried about suicide rates of teenage boys. They're just really worried about their sons.
Are young, dating myself, sorry, are college-age women interested in this question at all, or are they, like most college-age people, and mostly interested in themselves? No offense. It's just an age thing.
Well, I don't know if they've really figured out that they have to be interested in men qua the problem of being male in our society today. They're interested in men of, is there any good man around to marry and, you know, be supportive, and because I want my career and I want children too, and where are these men? I'm not finding them. So they're interested in men from that perspective. But to try to get through all of this cultural imaging to feel for young men and what it means to be a young man in today's society, that set of questions hasn't really come out very much. Now, there are a few women who have gone beyond just this issue of sons, which is an extremely important one. And one group of women are those who have married divorced men, men who are in their second marriage, and then they see all the financial liabilities that these men have, you know, with supporting their first families, and how is the second wife's children going to be educated. There's a set of problems that go with that terrain. And those women are concerned, especially if there seems to be any unfairness in the system.
I'm a lawyer, that's why I'm rolling my eyes.
Okay. Well,
No, you're right. No. I mean, it's not at you. It's trust me that everybody who's a part of the system is convinced that there's unfairness in the system against them.
Well, that's
Which there is, which there is.
Usually we talk about unfairness against women. Now we need to talk also about unfairness to men. So, you know, is there parental alienation from the former wife? So these men who love their children dearly can't get to see them, and they haven't got money to fight in court to try to overcome this problem. And the women, their second wives, experience this. They see the suffering of the men who have been alienated from their children. So those women are thinking about this problem, I think, big time. And then, you know, there's some women who have moved through the whole feminist movement, and they begin to sense the unfairness of some of the extreme feminist views against men. And they begin to think this is not our move toward a society that's going to have a better sense of equality. This is women's superiority and that sense of fairness and that old ideal of equality, which is at the heart of our society and at the heart of democracy, is not being captured in this particular perspective. And then there's some women who have been involved in some of the issues that really affect both women and men, such as domestic violence. And they see that sometimes women are violent too. Sometimes they look around and they say, well, men who have suffered from women's violence have no shelters for them. There's no place to turn. There's no counseling. These people are suffering. So those professional women start to say that there's something that's not quite right in the way, or not right at all, in the way that we're doing things.
So I'd like you to pick up on something that she was saying earlier. You talk about the images that you're seeing, either just culturally or, I mean, general. I know you're not a media. That's not your form, but.
It's interesting. So the arts are traditionally, like contemporary art, the role of the artist is in American culture anyway, 20th century American culture, I should say, is often to question and challenge kind of roles in culture and society. And I think this is one area where the arts have really, you know, like people have really gone to the furthest extreme in challenging ideas of gender and gender roles. The Brooklyn Museum has a permanent exhibition of Judy Chicago's dinner party, sort of the feminist icon piece of the art world. What am I seeing though? That's a little more complicated, because what I'm seeing is, so I work in an art school in Manhattan. I'm seeing an incredible openness and sort of lack of any barrier or division of gender roles among the students. So transgender students, transgender professors, cross-dressing students, and just like no discernible boundaries whatsoever among the students, and everybody seems to be like, that's the sort of dominant feeling. It's like that's,
The zeitgeist.
yeah, it's just everybody's okay with whatever you want to do and however you want to present yourself and whatever sort of place that you want to put yourself in a expansive spectrum of what gender could be. In the contemporary art world, it's interesting because you have people like the critic Gary Saltz calling out the biggest galleries in New York City for how many female artists they have on their rosters. And
As in not enough or too many?
Oh, as in not enough, like by far. Like, you list the top grossing artists in the auction houses today, and I think the first woman comes up, if she's in the top 10, not very high in the top 10. I think it was Cindy Shrink, I don't recall. And
So you're seeing that as a structural problem, but not necessarily something that's reflected in the culture of, so you're not seeing seeing discrimination on the human level, but structurally it seems to be a problem.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's like the sort of aging of the structure of the system, because the system has been sort of dominated by a very, patriarchal, it's a male-dominated system, and then just the idea of an artist as the male genius.
The difficult male genius.
Yeah, incredibly difficult. Yeah, is such a problematic but still pervasive, idea in the art world. And another area that I actually just recently. One of the curators of the Whitney Biennial, Michelle Grabner, is an artist, a mother, a curator, a writer, a professor at a very highly respected art school in the Midwest. And she recently, curated at the Whitney Biennial this year, and has a show right now in Chelsea. And it was noted in her review, in a review that came out in the Times, that it was mentioned the term soccer mom as sort of it was according to the reviewers a bit of humor. It was a male reviewer, but
Didn't go over well?
no, it did not go over well. He was called out for it, and there's sort of this letter to the editor exchange about him being sexist in his review, and then he responded that, well, I was a soccer dad for years and I didn't see it as a derogatory comment, but the argument is still alive and well. But then a lot of my friends who are my age who have young children like I do bring our kids to movies. So I see it almost on a generational level kind of playing out in a different way than it sort of does in an institutional way.
Are you seeing, going back to the Chicago thing, so I think that certainly there was a time, and the question is to what extent do we still have it? There was a time when a lot of art was focused on images of femininity and masculinity as part of what I will unscientifically call the sexual revolution. Is that still in play, or is that so passé it's just done?
I mean, the conversations that happen in the art world are so varied and diverse that I think it's always going to be an ongoing part of the conversation.
But it's just a little part?
I think it's not as central, because I think it changes in a lot of different ways. I think right now it's very, I don't know, if I had to say that if there was a dominant conversation or a very popular conversation has to do with more of like an institutional critique or a critique of like capital systems, which is, there's a gender conversation in that also, but not as specific as like the sort of 60s conversation.
Okay, so I can do this all night long, but you guys also get to ask questions. So Hands? People? Anybody? So just to tell you sort of what we're talking about, again. We're not accepting random questions this evening. It's about the role of men in society, right? And particularly the role of men in the family. And because I'm your moderator, I'm particularly interested in the role of men as fathers, but also as a class before they become fathers, right? Like, how do we get them interested? How do we create role models so that men want to get married and want to have a family and don't want to be Don Draper, right? How do we do that? And then what about the roles of men once they become fathers? Because it's a separate question. Obviously related, but still. Okay, so questions on that? Roll, come on, somebody be brave. Yep, see, I got it, back there.
I was wondering if you could comment on the role of men, maybe contextualized within American history or Western notions of the role of man and father, especially America's a very a society that really develops a lot after the Industrial Revolution. So post-industrial revolution, as people move into cities, societies get more urbanized. The role of men is maybe shaped the role of fathers in some different ways. When America was primarily agricultural. So I was wondering if you could shed some light on what that does to our notions of masculinity and fatherhood today, post-technology revolution.
So are there any particular, any roles that are particular to urban men today in the relationship to, in contrast to the men who went out and plowed the field?
Yeah, I think that kind of the historical framework.
I don't really understand the question.
So the question is, is the fatherhood role different for an urban male in two senses? One as compared to an agricultural male father, and she's asking the question particularly in light of the development of modern society. But you can either pick up on the time differential or you can pick up on the urban-rural differential.
Well, one thing that, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I had an idea. Go ahead.
Well,
Well, we've been doing this for
It's
20
okay,
years.
but I'm going to let you do it.
We're not husband and wife, but it's been going on for a long time. So, in an agricultural society, which a lot of America was, it's a rural American society, men had certain skills in tending to their farms and their animals, and because they were working on the homestead and they were based in the home and the lands around it, they had their sons in easy accessibility, and they could teach them their crafts, their skills, and there was probably a much greater communication between father and son, and one generation and the next, as this information and training was passed on. When you get to the modern world, or the Industrial Revolution, the men went off to the factories, the young boys stayed with their mothers in the home and were very much under female domination for many years, and the men became more distant fathers, partially because the work in the factories was so hard and alienating that communication between father and son got attenuated. In the late 19th century, there's some very interesting books of what happened to boyhood and manhood. And the boys, because they were under so much female domination with a female-oriented household that women often, scholars often don't talk about. They're always bemoaning the fact of male domination, but in point of fact, when the men were away, they had enormous control over the home and the children. But these young boys developed severe reactions to this. And that there's a term that was used in the literature called the savage boys. And they got so extreme in their alienation and their sadism and their masochism that the adults became afraid of them. This is late 19th century. As society tried to grapple with that problem, they developed organizations like the Boy Scouts, which of course are under horrible disrepute now for other reasons, but to try to give back a bonding between men and boys, men and sons, that would overcome the negative neuroticism of the young boys. The men themselves grew through this experience, and many of them joined the lodges. So the Elks, the Lions, the Rotary, there were many, many male lodges that were extremely common, and most men, middle-class men of late 19th century America, belonged to these lodges. Now the lodges were secret from women, okay? These were secret male societies in many ways. Now we have the transcripts of what their rituals were, and we find that there were men enacting really machismo images of hyper-masculinity. They were the red Indian, not the white man. They were the, I don't know, the Mesopotamian warrior, not somebody else. And these were all ritualized as a way of trying to define a masculine identity that was feeling emasculated, probably both by childhood under a female-dominated home for at least the first 6 years, and the emasculation that went along with industrialization and becoming like a clog in the industrial machine. Okay, so there is an example of what has happened historically.
As a result of the industrial.
As a result.
Okay, so now let me ask a question to you that made me think of, which is, so one of the reactions to these male societies, there was these male secret societies, right? And then essentially the notion of male secrets, that's what women objected to when they wanted to break into the workforce, because essentially their view was that corporations were the modern equivalent of these male secret societies, and I can't get in unless I can, buy into this, and we should be equal in all things. And there's some good to that, by the way, but there's some negative stuff that comes around. And then we go past that, and we move into now we have special deals for women, right? So now women want to have their own special society, their own special rules, the way the men have the special rules. And I'm thinking particularly, since we're here in New York, I don't know if you guys know about this, but there was somebody about a month ago, the Uber, right, the car service was going to have a car service just for women. So the drivers were all going to be women, and you could only get a ride there if you were a woman. It was a reaction to crime. So can you talk about that? I mean, obviously that plays into all the negative stereotypes of men, but can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing from that and your reaction to that?
Well, the idea of women having separate spaces. Well, that's one of the things that my friend Wagner also talks about, because women on the campus do have private space. They have, I don't know what they call them. They're not, the rape crisis center is another thing, but they have their own center. My friend wanted to organize a men's space, and the reaction from the faculty was furious. How dare anybody? Every space is man's space. Why should they have special space? He was called a Nazi. He was just the whole thing. But I think that it's pretty fair to say that for men who consciously think about these things, and a lot prefer not to think about these things, there is a sense that they've been invaded somehow. That there's no place where they can just be themselves and not have to be politically correct or whatever it is. And I think that's pervasive. And that feeling is pervasive.
That there's no safe space.
There's no safe space. So they'll, of course, you know, if you push them hard enough, they'll create their own, they'll take their own space.
There's an exception to that now. If you look at modern house plans, there's something called the man cave.
Right.
It's quite a recent development. So it's, in a sense, the guys can do their thing over there, but it's not too far from female surveillance. You know, it's not out in the bar.
But don't you think that that's
not-
because it's the flip side of what he was saying? So people feel like, well, every place is a man's place, so we need a special place for women. But in the home, every place is the woman's place, so you need a special place for the man.
But in the public world, every place is not the man's place anymore.
I know, but I think a lot of people, I agree with you.
It's a
but-
stereotype.
Yes, but that stereotype is largely bought into.
It's largely
Bought into.
body, oh, for
Right.
sure.
So, I mean, whether or not it's true is a separate question of whether or not that's the
I mean, look at-
perception.
Actually,
I think the reality is that nobody has a specific gendered space because we're all our spaces invaded equally at this point.
Oh, I think you're being way much of an artist here.
No.
No, I know.
I know that it is, but
No, I think
it's
that
an aspect of it.
I think no, I think that artists have always had much more fluid gender identities and gender roles and been much more accepting of openness on that scale. And I think that my mother is an artist, also crazy, but she's an artist. But she doesn't tend to see things in the same way. They don't tend to see stereotypes so much because they're spending so much time blowing them up. They're interested in blowing them up, so they try very hard not to see them except for in their art. So I think.
I agree that the stereotypes exist. I was just there seems to be another level within the idea of who owns or whose space is. That's just the point.
but I'd like to add to something Katherine said. I mean, what bothers me about this man cave is not so much that it's a private space for men. It's the content of the room and what is supposedly what men supposedly want to do. And usually it's described on House and Garden TV, House Hunters or whatever, and it's usually described as some place where men can be lazy, passive, doing stupid things, messy. Now, it's interesting because historically, I mean, wealthy people often had the equivalent of a man cave. They called it the man's study, where he read. Where the shelves were lined with books. So I'm wondering, how did we come to this? Why is manhood just represented as something that cannot, something anti-intellectual, something that, it doesn't have to be that way. We've had plenty of societies that have defined manhood as in terms of scholarship, for example, Judaism being an obvious example. And yet this is what we've come to. You watch House and Garden, and one show after another that a man is depicted as a lout.
Other questions? I have a million, but go ahead.
In defense of Don Draper, if I may, I don't think we read off Don Draper, simply that he's a bad and wicked man and he's unfaithful to his wife and he's a poor father and all that. I think we read him as a complex human being with difficulties and frailties and complexities with which we can all identify, and if we attend to them well enough, then we become better human beings ourselves. So, just an aside.
It's very sympathetic reading.
My real question is about two, what I suppose popular culture, if one was called, which one would call memes present about manhood. The first of these is this thing about campus rape, which is very prevalent at present, particularly among certain media outlets, you would get the impression if you read just the New York Times that every campus is a hotbed of rape, every male student is a potential rapist, every freshman woman who shows up at university can well expect to be raped within her first 2 weeks there. I think it's pervasive, I think it's dangerous, and I don't think there's been any effective male response. The second one, not on the same scale, but a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, wait, can we stop you?
Sure.
Do the campus rape, but now ask them a question.
And the question is, what do you think about it?
What do we think about rape? It's not good.
No. The question is, what do you think about this trope that the campus is dangerous because so many women are being raped, and what does that say about how can you acknowledge the validity of the statistics without misinjury?
First of all, the statistics.
Well, first of all, I question the statistics. Where are these coming from? And what is the definition of rape that they're using, or sexual assault? I mean, I question a lot of things about that. And universities, campuses that decide to do something about it, well, what do they decide to do? Do they abandon due process? And why are they conducting investigations of rape when that should be in the courts? And there are a whole lot of questions that are, at this point, unanswered.
Okay, so the usual statistic that you hear trotted out is that one in four women will experience a sexual assault on campus. So let's assume that that's grossly overstated, and it's 1 in 20. Okay.
No, 1 in 34 or 1.
Okay.
Whatever
it is. So I agree it's overstated. And as a lawyer, I will tell you they completely abandon due process. So that's not even a question. They just blow it, and they absolutely should go to the courts, and that's another whole thing. But the question stands, which is, how do you acknowledge the validity of the statistic and try to do something about a negative thing without creating a negative stereotype? Is there a particular way to do that you can think of? What are the elements of that? I'm not asking you to solve the whole problem.
Well, the only thing that, I mean, this is a conflict that's been going on for a long time. The rhetoric over rape, and the rhetoric about college etiquette codes, sexual etiquette codes. I mean, years ago it was Antioch College, and then somehow that died down, and now it's resurgent. But I mean, I think that Katherine and I would say that the only answer is not, maybe you can't do something about any particular campus immediately. What you have to do is conduct what we call intersexual dialogue. And so when both sides can represent themselves in the public square and come to some understanding of, well, what is rape or what is sexual assault, and who gets to define it and why, and these things have to be discussed. Ultimately, that's the only solution. There's no short-term solution by just, throwing people out of school because they've been accused.
So it's a public conversation,
Yeah.
and it's a public conversation that acknowledges gender.
Yes.
And allows people to represent those views and not try to pretend that we're all the same.
That's right.
Yeah, we touched on this topic earlier today. So, we do have to educate ourselves that there are problems with definitions of sexual assault. There are problems with the stats. We can't just buy into whatever is being said, and there are groups that want to paint the worst picture possible. And that needs to be challenged, and it's up to academics within universities and professionals like you who are lawyers to say, let's look at this more carefully. And I think Paul is right, a long-term basis is to get to a better understanding. But I think in the meantime, there need to be mechanisms where these issues are discussed. I don't like them when it's preceded by a training that's such an ideological feminist training that gives you the ideas of how many what an assault is, how many assaults there are. It is an indoctrination. And that indoctrination goes on because as professors, every one of us has to go to one of these sensitivity training. And when you look at their scripts, it's really very misandric.
Okay, so my husband was a professor for many years, and he used to refer to these as moral toilet training.
Yeah, well, there's a bit like that. On the other hand, we need to have, some kind of mechanisms because there are cases that occur in universities. But boy, we have to watch due process. We have to watch innocent until proven guilty. These are values that are very, very quickly eroding in our societies. Very, very quickly going out the window.
Ebola, right. They're going very quickly out the window. No, really.
It's true.
I mean, if you come back as an aid worker, you've just, gone to save the world, and you come back and now somebody's going to tell you that you have to be in quarantine. Okay, sorry. I'm off track. So
I think other questions that need to be asked are, and it's coming out now in these very statistics that we're talking about. I mean, there are men who claim that they have been sexually assaulted. So we need to bring that out of the closet. And how many guys want to talk about that? It's very threatening. At least as threatening as it was for women to talk about it. So things have to come out of the closet.
Mm-hmm. All right,
and then also,
go ahead.
I think one question that I would have, in view of these events, and why would any man want to have anything to do with women at all? I mean, it's so risky. If you say the wrong word, if you touch something, it's becoming increasingly difficult to promote friendships, cross-sexual friendships. And maybe the people who are behind this quasi-hysteria don't want men and women to have close relationships. I mean, all these questions, I don't know the answer,
right.
But I'm just saying that these questions are inherent in what's going on. And unless they get discussed.
I want to turn us to turn it slightly, because we've been talking about a lot of the negative stuff. Because we all know that there's negative stereotypes out there, and that this is what you work on, and it's accurate and true. So my question, though, is what is the source of the positive images? I'm going to start with you. Where are you seeing, and I'm not talking images, visual images now, I'm not just saying, talk to me as an artist, I'm just asking you a question, which is, where are you seeing the positive, helpful conversations about roles for men in the young man phase and in the fatherhood phase?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I see it in my faith community. I am a Christian. In my church community. I see it in my art community. The friends that I have in the New York art world, that's, I think, and one thing I think, in answering your question, I think that's one place that the arts have a unique role is imagining and providing a means of engaging or looking into sort of the world we want to see. Mm-hmm. I think that's a unique role that the arts can play in a way that's not necessarily, it's both more nuanced and often more simplistic than it is able to be articulated in art courts or in academia, because often it's visual or it's auditory or it's directly
not didactic.
Right.
Anyway.
But that complexity is often a trigger for having those like deeply profound and nuanced conversations about the complexity of the issue. And I think that the arts are sort of uniquely situated to help that. One of the things that in my experience with CIVA, Christians in the Visual Arts, we sort of did a study of what what the artists in our organization are looking for, one of the things they're looking for is a deep sense of community. And it's in a deep sense of community that you have conversations about, you know, what do you do with your kids when you have a studio practice and you have to have a job? Well, you know, we talk about that. And that's where I get the answers to those questions of, you know, how do I discipline my daughter and be, you know, represent a strong male or the type of male that I want her to grow up. I have 2 daughters, one's 3 and one's 5 months old.
It gets better.
Yeah. How do I, you know, how do I embody or provide a picture for her of who I want her to look for in the future? You know, those happen in community, in personal relationship, I think.
I wish I had something easy to say to this, because more and more the definition of masculinity is got to be a cultural one. And I know, probably myself and most women, have had a really pretty wonderful drive for the last 20 or 30 years. And we don't want to give up very much, okay? We want to say we can have it all, we have our families, we'll have our careers, but something has to give, and it probably has, some of the momentum has to come from women themselves. But what do you want to give up? What is it worth giving up? Late this afternoon, we heard a lecture where the idea was to give up pretty much all education and idea of jobs that are fulfilling and careers and, you know, everything that as women we have grown into to enjoy and to expect. So I, looking at my life, loved all of that. It was wonderful. And I think most young women who are excited about learning and the whole world of the mind and the imagination don't want that cut out. But what are we going to give up to give some space and identity to men? Because if there's not some negotiation on this front, then men will simply take it elsewhere. They'll take it back into secret societies. They'll take it underground. There'll be different worlds, and they may not communicate very much. I think it's an extraordinarily difficult problem. And I don't, you know, we've got this idea that you begin with dialogue, and we sometimes use the image of stereoscopic vision. So if you're looking at the world through just a woman's eye, you see only part of it. If you're looking at the world only through a men's eye, which happened through a lot of history, you're seeing only part of it. I don't see out of one eye very well, so I don't have very good sight. I should admit I don't have this analogy in my own human experience to any great degree, but the images, when you put two eyes together, you get a kind of depth to it. There's a difference, but it merges to give a three-dimensionality to sight, and by analogy to experience. So one of the things Paul and I have tried to do is to bring the men's eye, or the men's voice, whatever metaphor we want to use, in an educated way into this conversation, so that that is the basis of a platform for some kind of conversation. But it's going to mean giving up some things on the part of women if we're going to have a definition of masculinity which will be largely culturally defined in an urban world, and most of us are urban, or most of the educated population is urban or draws on urban culture. And believe me, try to think that one out. And it's not easy to do whatsoever. And maybe we simply have to start in our own relationships. How do you work it out with your husband? How do you work it out with your wife? How do I work it out with my husband?
So where are you seeing the positive role model, not role models as in people, but positive role concepts, images, where are they coming from? You don't see any.
No, things that I do see, but they're compromised. I mean, there are men who talk about fatherhood. They're very proud to be fathers, and they talk about how they, they help their wives, they vacuum the floor, and they do diapers now and then, they do a bit of cook. But you see, their whole notion of fatherhood is of assisted motherhood. So, it's compromised. It's not as if they can say, I have a role to play in my family that only I can play. They need me as a man, not as an assistant mother, not as a walking wallet, but as a, so that, and we came here to this conference with the idea that that was going to be a primary topic. Because Katherine and I have come to the conclusion, after 25 years of research, that the only possible source of a healthy collective identity at this point for men would be fatherhood. The other possibilities are all, impossible at this point. Women do all those things. So the question is, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
The question is, do we as a society think that there is some distinctive need for fathers? If there isn't, then a host of other problems begins. Because what are you going to do with all these men who cannot have a healthy collective identity? But if there is something distinctive, then we can at least say to the world, we need men for these reasons. Men are part of the family circle. We need them there. We need them in society. They have an honored role. If we can't say that, then it's game over, I think.
Other questions?
Actually, I wanted to, first of all, agree with what you just said, that men would find their new identity through fatherhood is one of the only ways that we could see that they could find their new identity in that way. And I wanted to ask you, which I also asked Dr. Schuhan, what do you think of the Swedish model? And would that be a way to introduce this new idea of fatherhood into our society?
Give me the details. I know that you're talking about paternal leave.
Yeah.
Okay.
Paternal leave in the sense that both parents have 480, I think, days of paid paternity or paternal leave. And 60 of those are strictly reserved to the men. So they can share those days any way they want, but if they want to take all of them, 60 of those have to be taken by the man. And that has led to that even in the workplace, it's considered very normal that a father would take the day off any day, saying, well, my children were sick. It's just, in the social norm, it has become much more acceptable that the whole idea of educating your children, looking after your children is the thing that is done by both.
Well, I mean, I can't disagree that it's a good thing to have paternal leave. The only thing I would wonder about is, okay, they have paternal leave, but what does paternal care actually mean? Does it mean that they're simply doing what their wives would have done, or is there something distinctive that they can do?
Well, I wouldn't know too much about leave itself, but being not for free. But I do think that it's not only something that they're just like a substitute for the mother in those 60 days, but it's seen that it's important that both parents, in their own roles, take part in their children's education. I do think that's important.
I think that it would be a good idea for us to learn more about what fatherhood means in Sweden. And I mean, God, we need ideas if that works. But as I say, I give a sort of conditional approval because I don't think it's helpful if we just continue with the idea that men and women do the same thing. They're interchangeable. You have a mother 5 days a week and father 2 days. And, it's got to be, it has to be a larger cultural context which says that fatherhood is distinctive and necessary. And I don't know if, I'm thinking now of my father died a few years ago, and I have had a lot of time to think about what a inadequate son I was. Of course, in hindsight, you know, he did everything right. Everything that I rebelled against, no, he did everything right. But it wasn't because his role was really to challenge me. And I didn't like it all the time. But that didn't mean that he wasn't doing his job. What bound us together was not, you know, sentimentality. It was, I mean, for many years I probably was a very sullen child, and he probably said, well, what am I going to do with this guy? And I knew that, and shortly before he died, we talked about this, and he did mention, he said, you know, for some years I was disappointed in you. And I accepted that, and because it was true. But never mind my ability to be a son. But he did his job as a father. He didn't have to make me like him. He had to make me respect him and accept his challenges and move up into the world and be an autonomous or semi-autonomous person, because there's no such thing as perfect autonomy. So, and we need to talk about this, what is a father? And it's not, I don't think it's primarily about sentiment. Sentiment is nice. If you do your job and can have a nice, loving, kind, not loving is a separate word, but I mean a nice relationship, that's additional. But there's something that is primary that needs to be done.
Yes, I'll go back to
Just
this.
briefly, because I want to.
Okay, I want to go back for a moment to the Sweden case, because I made 5 research trips to Sweden on a project that was called The Peaceable Ideal of Manhood. What societies had developed such an ideal? And I interviewed men in Sweden on each one of these research trips. My first day in Sweden, I was absolutely struck as I walked down the street. I saw the men in their beautiful business garb pushing their prams and getting a conversation in on the street corner. You know, that just kind of blew my mind, and it was happening street corner after street corner. And then I went to a concert and I saw a woman dressed in, you know, absolutely fire engine red, who was 9.5 months pregnant, singing away, and you know, she was absolutely doing her thing. And I saw that change of roles, and it was very, very striking to me as a North American. But as I interviewed men, and I went to different men's centers, and they had wonderful programs on helping men to become fathers and educating them, because our society doesn't do a good job of how to care for children, and they were educating men. But when we got right down to it, you know, these old questions, well, what does it mean to you to be a man? And they could not come up with an answer. So underneath all of this, there was a hollowness that hadn't quite been figured out.
More.
Yeah, so I was introduced to a lot of this conversation.
Can you stand up so people can hear you
different
better?
elements of this conversation several years back, probably in high school. There's a website called The Art of Manliness, and they put out like a series of books, and there's YouTube videos and stuff. Do you have any familiarity with that, or do you have any?
Well, not with that site. I mean, there are a lot of sites out there. Some of them are interesting. Some of them are full of ranting.
That one is, I found to be distinctive because it tends to be most, I mean, it varies from like very sort of mundane elements of like things like, you know, how to tie a tie, how to shape properly, to sort of, there's a lot of pieces on like history of like the evolving nature of male friendships, or like encouraging supposedly masculine virtues, self-reliance, industriousness, etc. So that one, and it's run by a married couple, Brett and Kate McKay. So that's one instance of a positive interaction with some of this conversation I saw. But I wanted to know if you had any.
I don't know that one, but that's interesting. I'd like to see it. Is it still up? Is it still?
Yeah, it's very popular.
The Art of Manliness.
The Art of Manliness.
Claire? Should I say that?
Yes.
I guess I'm really mixed up. I feel like confusion and sadness. On I'll talk about the confusion first. In the sense of like, we've been talking this weekend about this distinct, what is it, the distinct sort of that men bring to the table, and they need that, or they're going to just sort of hide in their man caves, or you know, not be interested in women at all, or all of these sort of ideas. And I guess I mean, even the last, so I understand that on a certain level. At the same time, when I ask myself the same question, you know, what is so distinct about me as a woman? What makes a woman? I'm not sure I get any close, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a man, so I don't know how close men are getting to that question, but I don't feel like I have a finite sense of like, this is my, you know, this is what I can hold on to, this is what I contribute, or this is.
And let me just add that it's being, as we get into surrogates and test tube babies and, you know, eventually, I mean, the one clear thing that women contribute is having babies.
That's right.
Right, and that's gonna be gone soon. You're gonna be able to have babies without us.
But
Right.
like,
Right.
not like, I know, and I know that's where we're like drawing the line, and we have been today as well in the conference, but I'm still not exactly comfortable with that, I guess.
No, but after we get past, but I'm just saying that
But you can't, even like the women can't have babies without men. So that idea that like women have something.
Well,
to
except they
contribute.
can.
I mean, okay, now we can, but I mean, if we're saying like, if men can now like have an over, like, you
Right,
know,
but-
have a womb or et cetera.
Well, the other
then
part of
women
it-
don't have that either. So
right,
it's
but then there's
still,
some women who can't have babies, so that doesn't, obviously that doesn't make them not women,
Right.
right? So that,
So, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just sort of like, I feel
Well,
like.
you know, but that question, what you're saying, was explored, when did FinRage?
90s.
In the 90s. There was an organization called FinRage, Feminist International Network of Resistance to Reproductive and Genetic Engineering. Anyway, well, they were, you know, they published
very
books.
prominent.
They were very prominent. And they had government, you know, liaisons. And they talked about that very thing. They wanted to defend the unique role of women in reproduction, and they wanted sexual autonomy for women, you know, cutting out men in as many areas as they could. So it is a good question, and it's the same question that I think men are asking.
And I guess that's the thing, like, we flip it. I mean, there's the book, Are Men Necessary, et cetera. I mean, it seems this sort of absurd question in the sense of, like, are people necessary? I mean, I guess that's what I feel like is what we're actually saying without saying it. Like, I feel like in the way that we devalue men, we devalue women as well.
Yeah.
We devalue them in different ways.
That's right.
And then also, I just think fundamentally, we don't value people anymore. Not really, not
Yes.
in any, like.
Yes, I just want to add to this that, you know, we can talk about this at the personal level. People have these questions about their personal identity. There's another level that what I call collective identity. And people want to ask me, well, what do you care about collective identity? You know, you as a person, as an individual, you have your education, you have your job, so why do you need this collective identity as a man? And at one point, I might have had to say, well, maybe I don't. But because we've had 40 or 50 years now of women very loquaciously talking about their collective identity as women, in effect that was throwing down the gauntlet. Because if women have this identity, then almost by definition, men have to come up with some identity.
okay, so we've been going for an hour, so I'm gonna give one more question and then I have a closer for that. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask, to what extent can we ground, we even speak of grounding identity in nature at this point in 2014? When I was in graduate school, one of the great things was essentialism. Speaking of the essence of any particular thing, is that where does nature fit into this conversation?
We still have female bodies and we have male bodies. So whatever our template is for interpreting those bodies and those experiences that come out of that physiology and perhaps mentality as well, we have to interpret and assess and do something with it. we can't get rid of these differences of one sex to another. There's still fundamental physical and probably mental differences as well. We can't erase that completely.
I guess the larger context of this is, how far can we go in devaluing the body and the material? We are embodied beings. We're not abstractions. So at some level, we have to at least acknowledge nature, no matter how we use culture to interpret and even override nature. At some level, we still have to accept the fact, and we should rejoice in the fact, that we are embodied living beings.
And that diversity is interesting. Despite all the problems we've been talking about all day, there's something that's intrinsically interesting about different experiences, woman to woman, man to man, but also man to woman. Do we want to have such a sameness and homogenized selves that we erase all difference? I have a feeling it won't be quite as interesting as it has been.
Doesn't that natural perspective sort of start to get to the sort of collective distinction of the maleness? And it seems like it's too general to have this sort of collective, we all need to do these things, or we all need to embody this sort of picture. But the sort of natural element that you both just described seems to be both more nuanced in being able to answer that question, or start to provide an answer to that question, and sort of simple enough to collectively bring it together.
I'm not sure I don't get your point. What is it?
Well, the natural distinctions that you're
Yeah.
talking about, that you just, and celebrating the sort of individual embodied humanity, the individual embodied human being. It does seem to sort of be the starting point for a conversation about a collective distinction.
Oh yes, it is certainly a starting point. I think to answer the question a little more clearly, I personally place a very high estimation on the ability of people to use culture to create meaning and order within what would otherwise be experienced as a chaos. But having said that, that doesn't mean that I'm a cultural determinist any more than I want to be a biological determinist. I mean, we're both. We live in both nature and culture, and that's how we have to live.
So let me ask a closing question, and we'll go this way and then with you, which is, and this is keying off a little bit of what you were saying before. So you've got the rise of women. Is it necessarily a zero-sum game resulting in the fall of man? I mean, do we have to? Let me ask the question clearly. Is it a zero-sum game? And if so, if it is descriptively now a zero-sum game, does it, as a norm, have to be, or is there a way to change that?
Oh, I certainly don't think so. And but it's interesting to mention that because I can't remember the name of the book or the author, but a few years ago there was a woman who The End of Man, right? Who wrote that? Anyway, it was reviewed in every the Times and everywhere else, and she was saying, well, she acknowledged that men have problems now, but she did it in a way that almost was triumphalistic. So she clearly felt that, yeah, there's a zero-sum game and women have won. And for her, that was enough.
But you don't think it has to be a zero-sum
Oh,
game?
no.
If it isn't, at the moment, a zero-sum game, women should really worry because there are ways of changing that zero-sum game that maybe as women or women with children you don't want. In other words, young men can appropriate a different identity on their own terms out of peer group affiliation and take an identity that is extremely negative, if not dangerous, to women.
I thought you were going into, you were saying we have to give something up. I thought you were going into they might take it without us actually giving it.
Well,
I take, but that's not what you're saying. You're saying it might be,
They might take it if there's no negotiation and something that's sufficiently affirming to attract men, then they'll go a different way, let's face it. And that can become extremely dangerous to families, to women, to children, to society. It's incumbent on all of us to think about this as an extremely serious issue, and that it's not just an issue for men. It really is an issue for women as well, and society, and children.
Well, through the family. I mean, I think that one of the things we've been talking about is that the family is probably the best place to focus all that, because you've got the man, the woman, and the societal elements, right? Because you've got all of that, and so if you work on those roles, if you work on the roles in that context, that might be the starting point for there. You don't think so?
There's been one thing that's been bothering me all day. We often have said that there's these alpha men and they have their wonderful jobs and this isn't a problem for them. But when men achieve identities through creative work and through work that has meaning for them, I think this is an important aspect of identity. I don't think it should be the entire thing, but I don't want us to think that it's negligible. In other words, if I were a young man, I would want an identity through my career if I had the opportunities for that. I have to be extremely sensitive to the fact that all men cannot achieve that. But if I had to make the choices as a young man in my own life, I certainly would make those, try to make those choices, because ultimately women still want to marry a man that has some financial stability and that has some identity and self-possessions through the identity that comes through work. I mean, as women, we've experienced this, but especially in an age where there's been such a colossal collapse of traditional definitions of identity, I think it's important to try to preserve that for as many men as possible, and then to work to try to find at least economic employment, if not self-satisfaction, through the jobs of the so many men that will not go that educational route. But I don't want to dismiss the alpha male that we sometimes sound like we're.
Like what?
Well, occasionally we say, oh, they're just those alpha men, but really most men.
No, on the contrary. My problem is always that when people talk about men having all the power and all of they are talking about alpha males and not ordinary men.
Right. Now we know that, but I'm just saying there's still something, if you're a young man, there's still something to think positively about education and careers and the opportunities that creates.
That's true, but I think that that's, but I think that is, I would define that in context of personal identity. So collective identity is another topic. It's related, but it's a different topic.
I think it's intimately related.
Wayne, the zero-sum game, do you see it? And if you do, does it have to be that way?
Those are such good questions. First of all, I'm thankful that my wife decided to marry a poor artist. Although educated, you know, I said right from the get-go, this is the path that I've chosen, and she went along with it anyway. So, and I think, yeah, if you have to think about it as a zero-sum game, you have to think about the nature of zero. The confusion that you're talking about there is like, so, you know, it goes to another level to what we value in humanity. You know, and as an artist, I take this question the same way I would take it in my studio, and And, you know, look at it in every possible way you can imagine it. So what do I imagine, you know, an ideal male role to look like? Or what do I imagine an ideal male role to look like in a family unit? And then I have to consider, well, if the family unit is the only place that the ideal male role exists in, well, what does that do with my friends who are not in a family role? And then I like that process, and sort of, I think, you know, methodological, a way of approaching these questions, I think works well for artists, and turning them over and sort of often looking at them from completely absurd perspectives to sort of be able to wonder what the possibilities are, you know, and what do we want it to look like, along with all the complexity of the individual that we have to bring to it.
Well, I think that we've used up our time, but I think they're going to be around, so you can keep on talking to them. So let's thank our panelists and let me just say that I think this kind of panel and this kind of event, the conference, this is what Youth Alliance is about. It's about having conversations that stay away from stereotypes and try to get at the grounding underneath all the chatter that's going on up here. It's about having serious, nuanced conversations that help to ground us so we have some perspective on all the noise and can filter it to some degree. So thank you so much for doing this.